Well, welcome to the Introduction to Xojo Programming webinar. I'm Geoff Perlman. I'm founder and CEO of Xojo.
And I'm Paula Fever, one of the Xojo software engineers.
Esteemed software engineers. And if you have any questions, there's a Q&A panel on your screen. You should type them in there and we'll get to them, as many of them as we can, Paul and I. Now I'm going to assume, well, we are going to assume that you have a basic familiarity with the with Xojo, that you've maybe done the tutorials and you've done a little bit of fooling around with programming, and we're going to be talking at a fairly high level in order to cover a lot of ground, but then we'll be sprinkling a lot of details through it. And I don't have a lot of slides here. We're going to jump into the IDE itself pretty quick, but there's a few things I want to cover. And speaking of which, what will we be covering? Well, where can you get help? That's an important thing. Where do you put your code? There's lots of places in Xojo, so we're going to talk about where you put things and why. How do I debug my code? We get a lot of questions about debugging, so we're going to talk about some things you can do with debugging. How do you handle errors? That's always an important topic. How do you customize the built-in controls and classes? And how can you make your code more generic so it's more reusable? So these are the things we're going to be talking about. And again, we're going to be talking about things at a high level. The goal of this webinar is that when you leave, you'll and you run into situations where you need to do something specific, you'll remember, hey, Geoff and Paul talked about that during that webinar. So now I know what to look up in the documentation and how to keep going and get started. All right, so where can I get help? This is one of the few things I have a slide for. So webinars, of course, just like this one, we'll be doing more of them. Example projects, Xojo's got over 100 example projects included. So you can look through those and probably find something that's an example of something you're trying to do. Autocomplete. So autocomplete's great because when you're in the code editor and you're not sure what's available, you can hit the tab button, or hit tab key rather, and you can see all the things that are available at the particular point in your code. So autocomplete's a great way to get help. I have been using Xojo for a very, very long time, and I still rely on autocomplete. The code editor has a syntax pane, and it'll show you all of the types and method signatures, and we'll point that out when we get into it. But it's a great place when you're looking for, I don't remember, what's the second parameter for this method? The code editor syntax pane is great for that. And of course, the documentation. The documentation is very searchable. It's a great place to find out information, and it should have just about all the things you need to know about Xojo in it. And then there's our forum. The forum is a great place to ask questions. Xojo staff and other users will answer them. It's very friendly. So make sure you check out the forum. You can also, of course, contact tech support if you need to. You can do that through our website. And then there's our YouTube channel where we have lots of videos. So those are those things. Let's get away from the slides now. And let's get into Xojo itself. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is where you put code. Now, Xojo is event-driven. That's the big thing. So what that means is that things happen and you put in code into events to respond to those things. So when you're trying to figure out where to put code, it's a question of what's going to happen that you're going to respond to. A simple one is, hey, when the app starts up and I want something to happen, where do I put that? Well, the app class, which is here in the navigator, has events, and one of them is the opening event. So the opening event is going to fire when the application starts up. So if you want something to happen as soon as it starts up, that's where you do it. Conversely, if you want something to happen when the app is quitting, you want to put it in the closing event. Now, we're not going to go through every event. I'm just giving you an idea. But there's lots of events for when the menu bar, a menu item selected from the menu bar, when a document's created, when the deactivated, for example, is when the application goes to the back, when another application is coming to the front. So you can look up in the documentation to see what all these events are, but there's an example. So the app has an opening event. Then the Windows have an opening event and a closing event. Controls have them. Controls also have a lot of their own events. Actually, let's look at the window real quick. If I double click on the window, you can see that there's a ton of events for Windows. And so it's just a question of looking through these events and finding the one that seems to make sense for what you want to do. For example, if you wanted to do something when a window is resized, right? That's an example. And controls, of course, have events. So if I drag a control out like a text field and you double click, there's a ton of events for those. Text changed, we usually highlight the most common event with a text field, the text is being changed. But if you wanted to respond to the user selecting text, you can do that here as well. So there's a lot of events. Now, the events also tend to be very similar across different project types. I'm going to make a new project, and this time I'll make a web project. And just like the desktop project, now there's fewer events for the web and even fewer for mobile. But you see there's an opening event. It's very similar. It might have some extra parameters and things, but you have opening and you have closed, that sort of thing. Also, pay close attention to what the events are named. For example, the opening event is called opening because it means in this case that the web page is in the process of opening. It doesn't mean it's open yet. So your code's executing prior to the page being displayed to the user. The same is true for the desktop. Now, for the web, we have some extra things, like we have the session, and the session object has its own events as well. A session is basically when a user connects to your web app. And as you can see, it's got an opening event. So if you wanted to do something when a user connects to your web app, then the opening event of the session might be the place where you want to do that. There's a lot of other events here as well, of course. And I'm going to make a project for mobile, and you will see that it's basically the same thing. Once again, let's wait for it to open. Okay, so we've got an app class and it's got events, right? So there's an opening event, there's a closing event, a deactivating event. You'll see that things tend to be named the same if this concept is the same across different project types. So events are everywhere. There are events for, if you're using sockets to, like the URL connection class to talk to a server on the internet, when data comes in, that'll fire an event. There's all kinds of events. Now, one of the things that comes up sometimes with users is they will contact us and say, hey, I'm putting my code into these various events, but I found that, you know, when I run my app on Windows, for example, the events don't necessarily happen in the same order. Well, I'm pointing this out because we don't guarantee event order. The Xojo itself doesn't control when these events happen. A lot of them happen, are sent to Xojo or sent to your app by the operating system. So the order might be slightly different. So you don't want to write code that is that relies on the event order, and it's almost never a necessity. You can almost always come up with a way to refactor your code, to rewrite it slightly so it doesn't rely on event order. All right, some other places you're going to be putting code is in methods. Methods can be attached to anything. I don't want to spend too much time on this kind of stuff because you've probably done it in if you've done the tutorial and stuff. But if there's an object in the navigator, you can add a method to it in most cases. So for example, if I want to add a method to the window, I can go to the plus button here and I can add a method, and that's going to attach it to the window. Now, again, where you put methods kind of depends on how you're going to use them. If you want a method, if the method only needs to be accessible to this window, well, attaching it to the window makes a lot of sense. But if it's a method that needs to be able to be called from anywhere in the application, the app class is global. You can put it there. Alternatively, you can add a module, modules are global as well, so you can add them there. That's true for properties as well. If you need to store some value and you need it to be available throughout the entire application, the app class is a great place to put it, or in a module. Modules are nice for organizing. So if you have a bunch of methods and properties that all are about one particular kind of functionality, maybe some service you're connecting to on the internet, or who knows what, it's a nice way to organize things by putting them into a module. Another thing that's a little different are timers. I always like to point those out. Here's the timer control. So timers, of course, you set them to fire at either a single time after a certain number of milliseconds, or fire over and over again, and then they have an event. They have an action event that'll fire based on that. So if in that case, if you need something that just needs to happen on a regular interval, a timer is great for that. Another place to put code that's going to run in the background, much like a timer, is in a thread. So I can drag a thread control out here, and it also has a run event, and you can put your code in there, and then you can have the thread running in the background. One of the things I want to point out here, though, is if you're using a thread to update the user interface, let's say you've got a thread running that's manipulating data, and it's going to take several minutes, and you have a progress bar or something that's on the screen, you need to use the user interface update event. So there's a add user interface update method you can call for a thread, and what it does is it allows you to pass data in the form of a dictionary, and then it fires this event, and it passes that data into the event with that dictionary. So the purpose of this is this will allow you to update your user interface in this one event and not lock up your application. If you simply do it outside that in the run event is going to run, and you'll find out that your progress bar or whatever isn't actually updating. So we have a special mechanism in place for threads for updating the user interface while the thread is running. So that's something to think about. And then another thing to look at, and again, we're not going to go into super deep detail on these. My goal is to give you an overview. The next one is the worker class, and the worker class is something that basically allows you to add an event. In this case, we're going to add, let's see, the job run event, and you can basically have this code running on a completely separate process. So it's going to run independently of your application. It's going to run on its own core. In fact, it can run on multiple cores. If I go back to the worker class object here, you can see what percentage and how many cores, the maximum number of cores you want to use. And what you do is you basically put the code in this event, and you can pass data into it, and you can pass data back out. There are events for this. You can see you can see when as the job's progressing. If an error occurs, this will get called when the job's completed. And for anything that's going to be a large data processing job, one of the examples I think we have is something that creates thumbnail images from photos. And so this will run completely independently of your application, and use all the different cores that your processor has. So it's a very easy and simple way to take advantage of multiple cores. Now you can't update the interface while you're doing that directly, because that's going to be a separate app running completely separately from your app. But through the job progress event, you can pass information back to your applications. Your application could update a progress bar, or whatever way in which you want to update things. Okay. And one more place I want to point out, and Paul, jump in if you think there's anything I've forgotten. This is something that people don't tend to think about, and that is we've got properties, but we also have computed properties. Now, we'll get to the debugger in a minute, but properties are basically the things that show up in the debugger, and sometimes you want to see something that would normally be in a method. Well, one way to do that is to create a computed property. When you create a computed property, if you haven't done this, what you get are two methods a get method for when you're getting the value from the property, and a set method when you're setting it to it. And typically what you do is you add another property to store the value, right? A regular property. Here, I'll just call it foo. And then in the get, you return foo in this case, and set, you would set it, foo equals value, right? The value is being passed in. And then what typically you would do is make the scope of this property private, because all it's doing is basically storing the value. The user's really accessing this. Let me call this my foo. So they access the computed property, and the methods get called, and it's really storing the value behind the scenes here. So this is something where you can execute code when assigning a property. A lot of times people want to do this and they end up creating a method instead, but then they can't necessarily see what's going on because the method itself is not going to show up in the debugger. So computed properties kind of give you a way to do that.
Geoff,
So
if I can jump in for one second on that. Hey, everybody. I just want to remind people too on the computed properties, Geoff showed a simple example there where we're just returning a property that already exists, but don't forget you can write full code in a computed property and you don't even need a backer. So that code in there could be looking up something from a database, for example, and then returning the value right there. And there's no actual property to speak of. It's always just running code. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing your designs. You might like this instead of, say, a method that's returning the value.
Good point.
And we do have, I did want to also just touch on, Geoff had mentioned using modules to store things that maybe need to be more global or accessible in multiple areas. And I also want to remind people that I also encourage the use of classes for that. Obviously, you'll need an instance of a class, but classes do have a feature that lets you create shared methods and shared properties on them. And those can be accessed from anywhere. You don't need an instance. So that's another design technique you can use instead of a module. And thirdly, there's a question here that's about workers. So I thought now might be a good time to address it.
Yeah.
And the question is, are workers good for pulling data from a remote database? Can that improve performance in this particular case? And yes, absolutely. You would just start your worker. You would probably need to provide it the connection information for the database, but then each worker instance can connect to the database, do the query it needs to pull the data out, package it up to send back to the main app in some mechanism. But how you design that's up to you, but it certainly can be used to connect to a database and send data back to the main app.
Yeah, and the progress data comes back as a string, so you just have to figure that out. But or you could also store it in some location, right? On the machine, right? You could write it to a file.
Yes, if it were remote, you could write it to a file and read that or something. You got lots of options there. But the general technique, the worker can access the remote database, grab the information, using its own cores or whatnot, and then the main app can have access to it.
Right.
All right, back to you, Geoff. That's all I had to say.
So there's lots of places to put code. It's really just a question of deciding what is going to happen that you want to respond to, and then going and looking for the event that represents that. Because there's so many events in Xojo, it's a virtual guarantee that there'll be an event somewhere that lets you respond to it. So you just got to look for that. Now let's talk about debugging code. I'm surprised at how many people have had no experience with a debugger. Jason in tech support tells me that every once in a while someone asks him, he'll say, have you stepped through your code in the debugger? And they'll say, what's the debugger? So the debugger is something that lets you step through code. And there are a couple different ways that you can trigger it. Let's take this field, for example. And let's say I'm just going to have here, I'll just do var x as integer equals 5 and message box x.toString. Okay, so we're just going to show that value. So I can, trigger the debugger with a breakpoint, of course, and I'm going to run this real quick, and hopefully all that other stuff I put in is not going to cause a problem. Okay, there we go. And I pressed a key, so text change fire, and here we are in the debugger. And you can now step through your code, and you can also see lots of other objects here. So because we're in a method and for control, we have the me variable. So that's pointing to the control itself. It's a desktop field. So it's the same control we're in. And it has self as well. It's pointing to the window that the control is on. And then there's my local variable X. Any globals will be listed here. And sometimes you have a lot of these. If I click on window, you can see all the different properties of the window. I included my computed property. There it is right there. And this can get a little overwhelming if you're trying to step through your code and track a particular property. And we just added in the current release a filter. So now you can say, well, I only want my foo. And there you go. So now it's just showing that one thing. And there's some filter parameters here as well. So you can choose for the variable name or property to begin with, contains, or ends with, which gives you a lot of control there. And you can also look, like if as we step down through code, you can see the different levels. If I want to go to well, here, let's clear this. I can go back to the variables and, click on the window so I can switch back and forth, that kind of thing. And the stack shows you how deep you are into your calling chain. So this isn't going very deep. We're just in window 1, text field 1, text changed. But if text change was calling a method and we were in that method, then that would show up in the stack as well. And you can switch back and forth between those, between the event and the method. But another way of invoking the debugger is with the break command. And that can be really handy when you need to invoke the debugger based on a condition. A lot of times, I find I'm dealing with a large amount of data, and I don't want to step through every iteration of a loop, for example, waiting till the conditions are just right to show some issue I'm trying to track down. So what you can do instead is just say, like if X is less than 5, then break, right? So now you've basically created a conditional break statement. That can be really, really handy in terms of trying to track down issues that are occurring when a certain condition exists. And I believe, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe break on exceptions is on by default. So what that is that, and we'll get to errors in a minute, but when an exception occurs in your code, the debugger will just automatically fire up and show you where it occurred and what exception occurred. So we'll get to those in a minute, but that's another place where you'll use the debugger. As I mentioned, only properties appear in the debugger. So sometimes when you're writing code, you may decide, between, I'm going to have a method or a property, maybe you're writing a function that'll return a value. You may decide you want to use a property, if not just temporarily, so that you can track it in the debugger. And last but not least, when it comes to debugging, we have a remote debugger. Now, the remote debugger is something that's used in very specialized cases, but when you need it, it's a godsend that it exists. It's an app. You can put it on another device, another computer, whatever, and you launch it. And then in the IDE, you can choose run remotely. And I haven't set up a remote debugger here, but you set one up and you can connect to it so that when you choose run remotely and you choose your device, Xojo will compile your application, a debug version of your application, like it does when you press run, and it will transfer it over to that other computer, device, what have you, launch it, and then it will run it on that device, and all the debugging will happen on your computer here. And that can be super helpful, especially if you're encountering some kind of bug that seems to be unique to a different platform than you program on, or maybe you have a user that's experiencing this issue and nobody else is. And so you can set up the remote debugger on that one user's machine and then step through your code on your machine and while they use it on theirs and see where your problem is. So Paul, do you have anything you want to add about the remote debugger?
No, nothing specific other than definitely don't forget about it. It is certainly super handy.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that when you discover that, gosh, if I could only debug on that machine, and then you remember, oh wait, they have a remote debugger, then it becomes very, very handy.
Yeah, I
So-
will say I've used it quite a bit. Like, for example, if you happen to be developing on a Mac and you want to test something or debug something on Windows, you can just have a VM of Windows running somewhere and then use a remote debugger to connect to that from your Mac, test your thing on Windows, and then you're still on the Mac. It's just super, super handy.
Indeed. So I'm going to open up a project here because next we're going to talk about errors. Now, I came from, I learned programming a long, long time ago. And when I learned it, generally speaking, what would happen is you'd call a function, and if something went wrong, the function would return an error. And then you deal with the error. But the problem is that ended up with, if you had a lot of those functions, you ended up with a lot of code where you had all these embedded if statements. You had an if for a function, you call another function, you have another if statement to deal with that error code that comes back from that one, and it goes on and on and on. And that creates hard to read code. And so in Xojo, we have something called exceptions, and they were new to me. Xojo was my first exposure to them. And essentially, and let me get an example here. Let me find a good example. Let's see, it's in one of the event handlers. Okay, so the way an exception works is you basically assume an error is not going to happen. And if it does, then you deal with that. So exceptions are used as try-catch structure. So you'll see I've got try up here, catch down here. In this case, this is code that's accessing a database row. And I put catch error as database exception. So what's going to happen is Xojo is going to execute all the code in the try section here, all of that. And in all of that, you'll notice there's no error checking going on. If an error occurs, then it will jump down to the catch section. So you basically handle your error here. Now, what I have found in my experience is in most cases, errors are not recoverable, right? In this case, for example, we're saving a record. So we just say the customer record cannot be saved due to an error. I could tell the user to try again, perhaps, if it turns out that in most cases that's what would solve it. But that's basically the best way to deal with errors. In this case, it's a database exception. For the typical case, it might be a runtime exception. If you're reading and writing files, there's an IO exception. And if you go to the documentation, you can look these up and you can see a list of all the exceptions that you can trap for. And I believe, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, I think if you trap for a runtime exception, you can then see what kind of runtime exception you got, correct?
Yes, if you capture a runtime exception, you can check its type to see what it is. You generally don't want to catch a runtime exception, though. It'd be much better to catch the specific one you're looking for.
Correct. And you can also embed try-catches within try-catches. In this case, I just have one, but if you wanted to have another one inside of it, you certainly could do that too. But it makes for much cleaner code. You have, fewer if statements. And again, what I found, when I was getting used to using exceptions, coming from a background of calling functions and expecting an error code, generally speaking, there's not a whole lot you can do, when those errors occur. You're probably, something went wrong and the user is probably going to have to start over in some way. So this just exceptions make for much, much cleaner code, which makes them great. Once I started using them, I just found my code much, much easier to deal with. Now you can also create your own exceptions. If you have code that given a certain situation, you want to fire an off exception, you can create a subclass, and we'll talk about subclassing in a minute, but you can create a subclass of runtime exception and make your own exception type. And then there's a raise method. So for example, let's go back to my sample here. I can make a class and I'll call it my exception. And I'll base it on runtime exception. Okay, so I've got my exception. And then if an error occurs, and should that error occur, I want to raise that exception. I want that exception to fire. I can say raise my exception, right? So that'll cause that exception to happen. And then, you can have a try catch command that says error as my exception to trap for that exception. So you can create your own error handling that way as well. Okay, so moving on. How do I customize the built-in controls and classes? All right, so I'm going to create a new project just so that I don't have to use all the stuff I created in there. All right, we got a new project. So let's say that you want to add something to an existing class or existing control, for example. There's a couple different ways to do that. One is to just subclass it. So for example, I'm going to make a new class. And if you haven't done much with classes, that's understandable. Object-oriented programming might be new to you, but I'm going to create a new class and I'm going to call this, I'm going to do something very simple. I'm going to call this my button, and it's going to be a subclass of desktop button. Okay, so now this is basically its own version of desktop button, and it has events. And I'm going to go to the pressed event, and I'm going to put system.beep message box hello world. Oops. Okay. So now this button has this code built in. And if I go to my window and I drag one of these out straight from the navigator, you'll notice that the super is not desktop button, it's my button, because it's not a desktop. Well, it is ultimately a desktop button, but it's a subclass, and that subclass is called my button, and it already has this event implemented. So now when I run this, what did I leave out here? Oh, I left out a quote. There we go. Okay. So now when I run this and I press the button, of course, there's the code, right? So now this is a very simple, example, but the idea now is that I could have these all throughout my application, and I don't have to write that code over and over again. And I can extend this. So for example, let's say, hey, this is great, but if the user double clicks, or if I as a developer double click on this button, you'll notice the pressed event is no longer there. Well, that's because the subclass implemented it. So all the rest of the events are there because they weren't implemented by the subclass, but the pressed event is missing. So there's a way you can add it back. And of course, you can create your own events as well. I'm going to create an event definition, and I'll just call this pressed because I want it to be the same. And then I go to my event handler, and then you just need to decide where you want the pressed event to happen on when the subclass is being used, like on that window. Do you want it to happen before this code executes or after? So I'm going to say I want it to happen after. So I can just put pressed. And then if I go and double click on my button on the layout, you see, well, now I have a pressed event. So now I could implement the pressed event specifically for this button on this window and still have a pressed event that is common to every place where I use this control. And you can do this with, any kind of control you want. You can add all kinds of stuff. It's a very handy thing to do. You can also extend the built-in controls and classes with an appropriately named extends keyword. A really good example, and we have this in the documentation, is the text area control doesn't have a clear method to clear the text. So let's say you wanted that. Well, I'm going to go to the app class here because I want to put this somewhere where it'll be global to my whole project. And I'm going to make a method, and I'm going to call it clear. And I'm just going to put extends control as desktop text area. And I'll simply say text equals quote, clear the text. Self.text. Okay, that should do it.
You got a slight typo in your parameter there.
Sorry?
And the end got cut off at the end of your parameter.
Yeah, it did get cut off. There we go. Okay. So what I've done is I've extended the desktop area to have this clear method just by using the extends keyword. And then I can use the parameter I passed in to access it. So this is just going to set the text property to quote, to an empty string. So now let's go grab a text area. We'll put that on the screen. And in my button here, let's get new button. And I can say text area 1 dot. Why is that not coming up? What did I do wrong, Paul? It should be coming up. Desktop text area. Oh, no, it's not. It should be auto-completing too. And it's not. What have I done wrong? Okay, I've gotten the app class. That should be it.
Sorry, I was muted when I was talking.
Oh.
The extension methods need to be global methods on a module.
Oh, right. I was putting them in the app class thinking they were global. Okay, so I'll move it to a module. I thought I should have tried that beforehand, but I figured that the app class is global. So I'm going to just drag this down to my module. Okay, and now let's give this a try. Okay, and if I say hello world and I press my button, there it is. So what I've done here is I've basically added my own method to desktop text area. Now, to be clear, you can do this on any class. I'm doing this on a control, but you could add something to, say, folder item, for example, if you wanted to, or any of the framework, just about any of the framework classes, you can add your own methods. And because they're in a global place, a module in this case, they're going to be available to every instance of that class that you use throughout the project. So that can be a really handy way to extend an existing class with the appropriately named extends method. And all the things I'm covering are in the documentation. So if you want to get more details, after the webinar, obviously look in the documentation. Okay. All right. So last but not least, and perhaps most importantly, how do I make my code more generic? We're going to talk about a bunch of different things here. So one of the things that people don't realize often is that with a method can have more than one signature. So when you're creating a method, and sometimes you want to use certain parameters and sometimes you want to use other parameters, but you still want it to be the same method, you can actually do that. You don't have to provide all the parameters in one method signature. To give you an example of that, I'm going to open a project where I did that just recently. Let's see. Here it is. Okay, so I've got a class here called dbkit, and one of its methods is, here, I'm going to open this up a little bit. One of its methods is bind control to database column, and you can see that it's expandable, whereas these other methods are not. Well, that's because this one has more than one signature, right? So there's basically two different versions of this method. In this first version, I'm passing a desktop control and then a column name and a table name. And then the second version, I'm passing a web control. And then a column name and a table name, but they could be completely different. So this is a single method with two different signatures, and in this case, two different implementations, right? But the only difference when you call it is the parameters. And again, they can be nearly identical or completely different. In this case, and I'm going to go into this a little deeper, is I want this class to work in desktop projects and in web projects. So what I've done here is I make a desktop version and a web version. And then in the inspector, if you go to the advanced tab, you can indicate, that shouldn't be on, you can indicate what to include it in. So the desktop version will only be included when I build a desktop app. And if I click over to the web version, it's only included in web apps. So even though I've got code in a single project that some of it's dealing with desktop and some of it's dealing with the web, I'm not going to get any errors because I have indicated what kind of projects this particular method should be included in. So having the ability to create multiple method signatures can be really handy because it just creates much greater flexibility with your code, and you don't end up having to have a zillion parameters to cover every conceivable case. So multiple parameters is one thing. And again, we talked about if you're writing code for, like in this case, this is a class that I want to work in many different projects, but I have some project type specific framework access, like accessing the desktop UI control here and a web control here. A great way to handle that is with the under the advanced tab using include in. Now, another thing you can do to make your code more generic, especially if it's going to be across different types of projects or different operating systems, is using the target compiler directives. And I've got one of those here. So for example, here's a case where I'm accessing some desktop framework stuff, in this case, desktop field. But I'm also accessing web code here as well. So I'm using #if and target desktop. So what this is going to do is it's going to say, if this is being built for the desktop, it's going to compile in this code. Else, if target web is true, it's going to compile in this code. So I can have desktop and web code in the same class, and I'm not going to get compiler errors when I go to run this on the desktop, because when it hits this, it's going to skip it because target web will be false because I'm not building or running on the web in this case. But I could drag this class into a web project and then use it in the web project. So this is a nice way if you're going to create compartmentalized classes that you want to use across different projects. Don't forget that you can use the various compiler directives to be specific, and this can be very specific. You can say things like target Windows, target Mac OS, target Linux. We have target x86 and target ARM if you need to be that specific, and you can combine them as well. So there's a lot you can do with these to make code that can all be in one place, but can run only on the specific targets that you care about.
Yeah, Geoff, and I can just jump in real quick. And just to be clear on the difference, the reason why there's a # in front of that is because this code isn't just skipped, but it is actually excluded from the compilation process. So it won't, when you're building for desktop, the code that's in the else if target web isn't even included in the desktop build. It is totally skipped over by the compiler.
Correct. Yeah. So that's the difference between #if and a regular if. A good point, Paul. Thanks for adding that. So you can think of it as, essentially, if you look at this method and I'm compiling for desktop, this line would be compiled in, this one would not. And this code would be compiled in, this code would not. It would be, like Paul said, entirely skipped. So that can be very, very handy. Another thing you can do for writing generic code is if you need to access things in a project, you go back here, such as, you need to write some generic code to deal with each window or each control on a window or each web page in a web project or each session. For almost all these things, there's a way to do that. And it's typically at the level above the thing that you're trying to access. So for example, windows all belong to an app, right? So if I go to the documentation and I look up a desktop application, you're going to see that you have, where is it? Okay, you have a window count, right? So you can see how many windows there are. You have window @ which takes an index and returns a window. So window count, if it says there's 10 windows, you can then loop through, you can write a loop that loops through and passes the index to window @ and get each window, right? So that's a way of iterating through all the windows. Now, in this case, there's also a Windows iterator. And if you haven't used an iterator before, it's a really handy way of essentially doing what these two things do. Let me give you an example. So here, I'm just going to grab a button. And so normally what I might do is say for I equals 0 to app.window count -1, because window counts that starts at 1, right? And then I can access then I can say var w as desktop window, w equals app.window at I next, right? So this is going to loop through all of the open windows, right? It's going to get each one, the index, pass it to window at, and W will be that window. So that's a great way to do it. But when a class rather has an iterator, like this has, you see it says iterable over here, Windows, well then you can do it more simply using for each. So I can say for each W as desktop window in app.windows. Okay. So this is doing the same thing. It's iterating through all of the windows and automatically assigning W each time. So each time through this loop, W will be equal to one of the windows, right? So this can be really handy. The one thing that's different, however, is, and Paul, tell me if I'm wrong about this in terms of Windows, this particular iterator, but generally speaking, when you use an iterator like this, you can't rely on the order. You don't know what order they're going to come up in. This, they're going to come up in a specific order. This, you can't be sure what the order will be. Normally that doesn't matter, but when it does, you'll want to fall back to using this method.
Right. Yeah, you can iterate through arrays and you'll get a specific order each time, but something more generic like this, the order could be provided by the OS, so it's not guaranteed.
Right. A place where you'll find that you use iterators a lot, I find, is with folder item. So for example, if you need to drill down through directories or folders, for example, if I say var f as folder item equals special folder.desktop, right? So now I've got the desktop where I can now say for each file, let's say, as folder item in f.children is the name of the iterator. Okay. So now I've got the desktop and I'm going to iterate through, and it's going to, each time it goes through, it'll grab an item from the desktop and that'll be represented in file. And then from there, you can access the files, you can do whatever you need to do. But this way, you can see that it makes something very simple rather than having to deal with count and remember that you need to subtract 1 and all that. You just iterate through, it assigns a variable for you to the type, and off you go. So that's also a really handy thing in Xojo. While we're here in the code editor, here's a great place to see the syntax help pane at the bottom. This is showing how when you make a folder item, there are 4 different constructors that can get called, one with no parameters, one that has passes the source as a folder item, and then various path signatures as well. So you can see that with anything. Here's window at, it's showing index as integer. That can be really, really handy. Oh, and I want to go back to autocomplete. I mentioned it earlier. I talked about the fact that autocomplete can be really handy. Well, so if I go here and I press tab, here's everything that can be called from here, everything that's accessible in the app class. But it's important to remember that it looks at how you're using it. So for example, I'm using this as a function, so it's only going to show properties and functions. If you want to see everything, then you can, this is a little trick I use. You can put call, which basically calls a function and doesn't return anything. So I can then do this. Well, now I see everything, stuff that even normally wouldn't be accessible, unless I wasn't calling it as a function. So if you just want to quickly see everything that's available, and because sometimes you think something's a function that returns a value and it turns out it isn't. You were just mistaken. I do this all the time. Well, you can just quickly type call and hit autocomplete, and you can see everything. And if something shows up that wasn't showing up before, that means chances are you were trying to call it as a function and it's not a function. Okay. Let me look at my list here. Okay, next we're going to talk about typecasting. So, let's say we were going to iterate, as an example, we're going to iterate through all the controls on this window. I'm going to do for I as integer equals 0 to self dot control count. Okay, -1. So there's all the control. We're going to loop through all the controls, right? Okay, and then I'm going to say var c as desktop control, and c equals self represents the window in this case. Control at, just like we had window at, we have control at I. So C is now a control, but it's a desktop control, right? It's not a text area, desktop text area. It's not a desktop text button. It's just a desktop control. And actually, let me check. Yeah, okay. So control at actually returns something even more generic, just a plain old object. So there's probably not a lot I can do at this point with C because it's not anything specific. So let's say that if the control was a desktop text field, for example, I want to assign a value to its text property. Well, what we need to do now is turn C into that, or actually first check to see if C is a desktop text field. And if it is, convert it into that. And let's see how you do that. So we have something called is_a. I can put if C is a desktop text field. And if, okay, so this is testing to see if this particular iteration through the loop, if C is a desktop text field. If it is, then I want to access its text property. Now, you might think you can just do this, but that's not going to work. And the way I can tell that's not going to work is with autocomplete. You'll notice as I start typing, it's not auto-completing text. Well, that's because it doesn't think that C is a desktop text field. And it's right, because it's not yet. So what we need to do is we need to cast C into a desktop text field. And the way you do that is use desktop text field. Oops, desktop text field. Let me get my typing right here. And you pass C to it. Now you've basically converted C. Well, you haven't converted C, but you've created a copy of C that's a desktop text field. And from here, you now have access to it as a desktop text field. Notice that text now auto-completes. And I can put quote, quote. So now I'm going to go back here and here, let's just get rid of that. And let's drag out a couple of controls. Okay. And let me get rid of this stuff. Don't know what that's going to do. Okay. So we've got some controls and I'm going to put some values in some of them. Okay. All right, so let's run. Oops. What did I do here? Okay, I thought it was, well, we can make it an object. I'm pretty sure that it's control at self dot. That should be correct. Let's see. Okay, so we've got some values in these fields, and I'll press the button, and you can see that it set the value of the text fields to an empty string, but didn't touch the text area. And that's because in my loop, I'm checking to see if it's a desktop text field. And then again, to set it, you have to pass that control or that variable rather, to essentially the class that can convert it into the appropriate type. Because if you don't do that, it's still an object in this case, right? So use is_a to check to see what type of object it is, and then it's that same name that you use to convert it. And at that point, you can use autocomplete to access it. And you can, I could then have another if statement that checks to see if it's a pop-up menu or something else. But that's what typecasting is. It allows you to take something that's one type and convert it up to a another type. Paul, is there anything you want to add about typecasting from your experience?
No, that seems about sums it up.
Okay. I use it a lot with controls. I mean, there are other places you can use it too, but I use it a lot with when I'm accessing controls.
I will point out, Geoff, that it is 5 minutes of.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, we're going to go quickly through a couple last things. And then are there, how many questions do we have that are outside the stuff we've covered so far, Paul?
I've taken care of questions coming in via text answers, so they'll be in the
great.
log of the report and stuff. I didn't want to derail the important things you were going through.
Okay.
If we have time at the end, I can touch on a couple of questions.
Okay. Then I'm going to run through a couple items real quick. Introspection. If you need to write code that's going to generically look at a class you're using, meaning I need to know what methods it has, I need to know what properties it has, that's what introspection is for. It allows you to generically investigate a class. So look up introspection in the documentation and you'll find lots of examples of how to use it. It's one of those things where when you need it, you'll just be so thankful it's there because there are some problems that can only be solved with introspection. And last but not least is interfaces. You can look these up in the documentation, but essentially interfaces allow you to have different classes that you can access generically by providing a set of methods they all share. So you might have a method of a certain name and with a certain set of parameters in 3 different classes. And normally you'd have to say, well, if it's this kind of class, do this. If it's this kind of class, do that. But instead, with interfaces, you can make a class use an interface, and then all the classes that use that interface you can access generically. So this is another way of making interfaces, or another way of giving you generic access to multiple different classes. Again, it's one of those things where if you need it, it's a very handy thing to have. So Paul, you want to bring up a couple of the questions real quick?
Yeah, I'll just touch on a few here that I had answered previously. Someone had asked about the navigator, and you might want to bring that up on your screen again, Geoff.
Okay, let me get back to the navigator 1 second.
And just grouping of things in the project.
Yeah, let me start my screen sharing. Yep.
So just looking at the navigator there on the left, you can see all the various project items. And if you do need to group those in some way, there are folders available that you can pick, and then you can drag things into folders. And then you can actually group stuff inside of modules, which is a kind of a weird, unique thing about Xojo. And that lets you essentially build a visual form of namespaces that you may have seen in some other languages. So those are 2 ways you can group your project as a whole. And then someone else said, or maybe the same person had asked about grouping things that are on a window, for example. And you can't really group the controls that are on a window in the navigator directly. However, you could, this is commonly done with labels, is you could convert the label to be what's called a control set. So that rather than having, say, 20 labels on your window, you'd have a single label that's a control set that only appears once in the navigator. So those are just 2 little tips and things to look up if that's something that bothers you.
You can also create complex controls with a container. So for example,
that's a great point, Geoff. You can build your own complex or, composite controls with a bunch of things in it. So if you do have a complicated layout, rather than having your main window have, 50 controls on it, you could maybe have 5 containers, for example.
Yeah. So I've made a container that just has a label and a field. And then I can drag this container out, and there it is. And I can have as many of these as I want. So, and despite that border, you won't see the border when you run. But if I run this now, you're going to see that I now have 2 of those. And you can just think of that as a control. There it is. See, I've got my fields and my labels, and I can treat those as their own control. And you just access them through the instance. So for example, if I want to put a button on here, so this one, let's go to the inspector. This is container 11. Okay, so I'm just going to go here and say container 11 dot text field 1 dot text equals foo. Oops. Okay. And then I run. And I press my button, there it is. So I addressed the code by the name of the container and then the name of the control inside the container. And you can add methods to containers. You can do all kinds of things. Container controls are very powerful.
Yes. Yeah. Most of the Xojo IDE that is built using Xojo uses containers all over the place. All right. So another question that comes up anytime we let people ask us question is where is Android support? And I will just say our Xojo Developer Conference is coming up at the end of April next month, and you'll hear more about that then. Let's see. Another question that came up here.
By the way, though, if you have a Xojo Pro license, you can get access to the Android betas, the builds that we're providing if you want to test.
Yes,
Android
if you have a current Xojo Pro or a Xojo iOS license, you can email customer support and they can flip a switch for you to access the current Android pre-releases.
And it's looking really good, but I won't say anything more. Go ahead, Paul.
Let's see here. Someone had asked when we were talking about you showing the pound if stuff to check if you were running on Windows or Mac or something like that, if you could check specific versions of Windows or Mac. And I just pointed out that, yes, there's a system.version method and a system.version data class that has that information, so you can check it at runtime. They're not constants though, so you have to use the regular if with them rather than the pound if. But yeah, you can check that at runtime if you have a specific need.
Okay.
And there was just a couple other questions about grid and listbox, and someone was asking about a more specific grid control. And I just mentioned that, yes, we are working on a more generic grid control, but right now the listbox is very powerful. There are several videos about the listbox already on the YouTube channel that show some amazing things you can do with it. So you might want to do a quick search there and check it out. But the listbox does let you embed checkbox in it at the very least, and you can do all kinds of drawing in individual cells to make some pretty unique and powerful looking user interfaces.
And I think it's got more events than any other control.
Without a doubt.
You can see, you can paint the cell background, you can paint the text in the cell, that you can even paint the disclosure widget separately from everything. You can do just about everything with a list box.
And yeah, really, that's about it for specific questions that make sense to address here.
Okay. Well, we appreciate everybody coming to this webinar. We're going to keep doing more and more webinars over time. And of course, you can always reach out to us via email, on the forum, etc. We love hearing from you. We love hearing about the stuff you're doing with Xojo. We love, helping you be successful with it. And we will continue on our quest to make Xojo better and better as each new iteration of it comes out, and we look forward to providing you with some great stuff in the future. And I will mention again, as Paul did, we do have our conference coming up in London at the end of April. We'd love to see you there. Especially if you're in Europe, it's pretty easy to get to London, and it's just great. The internet's a wonderful thing, and forums and all that are terrific, even webinars, but it's totally different being in person. We really, really enjoy being in person and seeing all of you. So if you can find a way to make it to the conference, it's the last week of April, it'd be great to see you there. So with that, Paul, I appreciate you co-hosting this with me. It was great having you here. And to the rest of you, thank you for coming. Bye for now.